Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, a nice Christmas Eve episode, and our last regular episode of the year. Because after this, you can look at it for next week. It will be our 2022 retrospective episode, which is probably going to be about 4 hours long at this rate with everything that has happened this year. But it should be a fun time to look back and to really retrace our steps and try to weave the entirety of 2022 into this great tapestry that I at least aim to create with this show. Of course, I am Constantine Martelli, joined by my co-host GSP, and we have about a standard fare for you in the news state. Shouldn't be too long of an episode. A nice little light send off for our normal episodes of the year. I say it's fitting for the occasion, fitting for the date. And I'll turn it over to you for some updates on what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Okay. So, as it has been the case for the last 3 weeks, the front lines are um, very stable in comparison to September and October. If we look at where the greatest amount of hotspots that are happening, they are in the east, in Donetsk, particularly around the city of Bakhmut, but everywhere around the western regions of Donetsk city as well. Um, in the south, in Kherson, there are artillery duels. Nothing significant really has been happening other than that. As far as I know, Kherson is still one of those cities or towns without any energy, and people have left. Those that remained behind after the Russians retreated out of the city to the east bank of the Dnieper River. Um, there still isn't. There was all that talk in September and October that the Ukrainians would eventually break through in Zaporozhye and cut the Russian occupation in half at Melitopol. Now, Melitopol has had incidences. Um, there has been a bomb attack that injured two officials. This comes a day after another I should say, car bomb attack. Another one, another sort of, well, I mean, they're terrorist acts. And previously, as we're still talking about the South, another government official in Kherson was involved in a car bomb attack that did kill him. Uh, from what I read, he burned alive. But the front lines haven't changed, and Zaporozhye is one of those regions that began fortification in order to the north, the Ukrainians from taking any more land. I'm talking about the Kremenna, Svatove, Kupiansk direction, immediately opposite of Kharkov region on the border with Lugansk. So I don't think we're going to see anything of the sort. And I think that earlier that most of the fighting is now happening in Donetsk and Bakhmut. And this probably indicates, I think, for a lot of, let's say, for a lot of military advisors in the West, they've come out. Milley, for instance, he's been reprimanded since then, but Milley 3 weeks ago said this is about all that Ukraine is capable of taking, and they really should go to negotiations. He's not alone in that sentiment,
But I will
and
point out,
it's
in all
looking
fairness,
increased.
that Milley has been the biggest gaslighter of this war. You'll recall he's the one who circulated the Kiev will
Yes,
fall in, what was it, 72, 96 hours, whatever. That came
yes,
from his
yes.
mouth, and so have a lot of the other things to try to trump the Russians up. So when, then, of course, they don't meet said goals, it looks, quote unquote, bad on them. So just keep that with a
Yeah,
grain of salt whenever you listen to anything that comes out of Milley's mouth.
that's true. That's true. That's a good point. Although I think he can't like. I agree, but that said, I don't think. Um, right, you can never be too sure. But that said, not everything can be an instance of gaslighting.
True, true.
However,
And I'm more inclined to
we
believe him on this point, but I just wanted to put that out as a general disclaimer.
right. So far, after um, over a month and a half now, nothing has happened there. I do think one of the reasons why the Ukrainians lost, oh, now the name escapes me, the town directly south of Ugledar, and they've not been able to recapture it. That's a frozen conflict now. So the idea of going to Mariupol, that's also finished with. And one of the reasons why the Russians have been successful in taking Marinka, for instance, is because of that. Because all the attention right now is in Bakhmut. There are some early indicators. Kadyrov has said that they're mopping up parts of Soledar. Soledar is about to collapse, according to him. The thing with Kadyrov is he says a lot of things that really haven't happened yet. Uh, that isn't to say he can't be wrong, but many of his predictions come early. And I think it's because he's so familiar with war that I think he knows the stages. And indeed, in Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have begun to dig trenches in the center of the town. Bakhmut is about 75,000 people. It was, anyways, before the war in 2022. I imagine some of the population left as well from 2014 onwards, but it's about 75,000. If you include Soledar, I don't know, maybe it goes up to 100,000. So this agglomerate is not, it's not huge. It's not like it's smaller than Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. It's about half the size of that. But the fact that they're willing to dig in trenches, and I've seen the photos, it tells you that they are not going to give up this town, despite them repeatedly saying, or rather, I should say, the Western media repeatedly saying that Bakhmut is not a strategic location. It is actually a very strategic location because once they lose that, they have Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and after that, it's just all, Eurasian prairie that goes to the Dnieper River. There's just nothing in between. Um, some tiny hamlets, but nothing industrial, right? The thing about Donetsk is, and the Donbass and Lugansk areas, but particularly the Donetsk Republic, is that it has a ton of little industrial towns that are like satellites around a bigger town. So the whole thing is actually, it's deceiving. You think it's all like fighting in the country, but it's actually like it's more like a sprawling metropolis with small pockets of farmland in between other areas that are industrial. So, and of course, everything was, in the Soviet era, was built to withstand a nuclear war.
I,
So,
I just have to say, speaking from personal experience, looking at least the layout of the land with the farmland interspaced with the industrial zones reminds me a lot of just driving through the rural Midwest. That's what it feels like.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh,
If you want just for the audience, if you just want like something to put to mind to it, like it's where you do have these urban areas with the industrial centers, then you go out, it's while the farmland, etc., etc.
yeah. I mean, Southern Ontario is like this around the horseshoe, right? Like, in one way, you could look at Toronto to Niagara Falls as just one gigantic city. There are pockets here and there that break it up into some rural land, some areas that are not as dense. Jersey has this aspect to it as well. So that's kind of like the terrain that we're talking about. Now, the fighting, as far as I know, from what I've been reading, in Bakhmut has been very intense. The losses of the Ukrainians are higher than the Russians. The 93rd Brigade has been essentially retired. It's been taken completely out. And the last 3, 4 days, the completion of a rotation of them leaving that front line with other brigades coming in has been achieved. Um, the other fighting that is happening is further to the north. There is a possibility of the Ukrainians maybe making a breakthrough in Kremenaya. They're in that Sherwood Forest area. And um, although they've taken many losses there, they continue to do, what they call reconnaissance with force. These are small reconnaissance teams, but they're generally well outfitted with military material. So if they're able to take a certain portion, they will. If not, they're able to retreat. The Russians claim that they're taking out, every time they do this, they take out 1 to 3 guys, maybe a vehicle here and there. But the Ukrainians have been trying for months. Basically, this area is part of that whole Kharkov-Liman gain that happened for the Ukrainians in September and October, and they're still trying to push. Again, I don't know how well fortified this area is by the Russians in order to stop that, because if this part falls, the Ukrainians will be threatening Lysychansk all over again. So that's really how tenuous it is. Um, and that's basically it for the front lines. If I could add one more thing about Bakhmut, is that the fighting in the south of the city of Bakhmut has developed much further for the Russians. Wagner has pushed out further into the city. They're not just in the city proper on the east side, several blocks in, but now they've done that the same in the south by taking Opotnaya. However, they are now moving further west. So there's kind of like a pincer movement. From the south, they're moving west. In Soledar, they expect you know, for something to happen. Now, as far as something happening, the likelihood is much stronger than I would have said a week or two ago, primarily, and we'll get into it, but primarily for the meetings that are taking place. Uh, Putin, according to Peskov, was somewhere on the front lines in Donbass with Shoigu. He was also with Shoigu in Minsk.
And notice immediately after how this news came out, Zelensky was allegedly on the front lines in Bakhmut before taking his long haul flight to go speak to Congress in Washington
Yeah,
D.C. So that it believe what you will about that, but I do think it's funny that that all of a sudden happens. Of course, after there's all these machinations with Putin and what's happening in Belarus right now, which we'll get into, and Putin's visit to Donbass.
right. And I don't know what to say because there were people from Kharkov that were basically saying, "Look, the area that he's in right now, that's in Kharkov. That's not in Bakhmut." Um, so this was like on Ukrainian Telegram, basically people posting this. Was he really there or not? I don't know. Unlike when he was in Kherson, or unlike when he was in Bakhmut back in June or July of this year, where they were willing to pan out and show, like, basically um, do more of a larger environmental portrait, to use a photographic term, to give a sense of the location. They weren't doing that. So it was very close, it was very tight. Um, Everything that Ukraine does is for a Western audience first and foremost, rather than a Ukrainian one, right? And the reason for that is just like the strike on the Kerch Bridge, the attempted strike on the Russian Navy, that missile a few weeks ago that crashed into. Well, it didn't crash; it was actually knocked out of the sky, but it was knocked out of the sky right above Engels Air Force Base. All of this stuff is done in order to sway the opinions both of the West and the Russian public that look, you want to get rid of Putin. It's not safe. we killed Daria Dugina. None of these attacks will change the outcome of the war. They're basically for people to build an argument in order to change the direction of the war of decision making, or they're there for people usually with less power, who don't have political power, to begin to panic, and who can't see through that, and will begin to put political pressure. Demonstrations, I'm sure they're hoping could take place because of this. So these are that's the role of these PR stunts. Basically, that's what they're there for.
Yeah, that's to nobody's shock, especially once again with Zelensky's visit to Washington, D.C., which we will get in later on the show. But it is to woo these Western audiences, so you can have Mitch McConnell get in front of the American press and say,
Yeah.
well, this is why we need to send however much more to Ukraine. This is why we need to do X, Y, or Z. Or replace McConnell with any Western politician so they can go there and, especially in Europe, and tell their people, here is why we have to deliberately handicap ourselves so Zelensky and the Ukrainians can accomplish X, Y, and Z. Where what's happening in Ukraine is going to continue on as is. The political powers have already been solidified there, and those who are going to willingly fight or fight under duress or whatever, they're already
Yeah.
with that. The people who don't want to be in Ukraine have already left, whether they've gone to Russia, whether they've gone to a country like Poland or even a Western country. So it is to sway, once again, these outside powers and try to influence the war in that direction because inside Ukraine, they're more or less doing all they can already.
Yes. So yeah. I mean, I mean, if we want to keep talking about Ukraine and battlefronts, there's a lot of suspicion right now uh, that the Russians are preparing for some kind of offensive in Western Ukraine. I've said this for months that I do not believe that the Russians are going to do that. Now, the idea that the Russians are going to use the Belarusians to help them in invading Western Ukraine, I don't believe that. I have always said, even when this war started from the very beginning, that the Russians are never going to go into that area. They've never wanted to, and they won't. Um, the feint around Kiev was just that. Everybody who was a military analyst in the Pentagon knew that 150,000 Russian troops and about 32,000 Donbass troops who were not going to go into the Kiev region, spread out over an area approximately 1,400 to 1,500 kilometers, was not going to endanger Kiev. Um, so my feeling is the reason that the Russians are building up there is in case the Poles enter.
Yes, I was just about to say that, and I touched on this briefly in the solo episode I did last week. But the Belarus buildup is a contingency plan if there's some sort of escalation, whether that be because of the situation with Kaliningrad and Lithuania's interference with that, whether that be because Poland is more apt to get involved, or really just any NATO front opening around that region. That is what the Belarus front is for. It is, I wouldn't exactly call it a defensive move, but it's far more of a defensive move than it is an offensive move. It's to hedge their bets against whatever might happen in the coming months with, let's just say, the more volatile NATO members such as Poland, Lithuania, etc.
Right. And when Geo was on, but I've also said the same thing before, that one of the things that Putin has been waiting for, and you have to read between the lines of what Putin has been saying to understand him, and to uh, not believe every word he's saying. Like when he's saying that he was shocked by what Merkel did, I tend to disagree. I think the shock is there to conceal the weakness of the Russian hand at that particular time. He knows that all along they've never been a partner that they can trust. But it is because nothing else is in place that the Russians have had to go along with it. It's not, I mean, let's say some more, let's say some less intelligent analysts or even less intelligent Russian politicians may think that it's Russia's, naivete and good nature being taken advantage of. But as we said on previous shows, there was really no way that Russia could do what it's doing now in 2014 from an economic point of view, because it would have been it would have been devastated, economically speaking. So when um, we were lied to, and that's true. That's true. Or when Putin says we were lied to about NATO not expanding, that's true. He wasn't there; he couldn't do anything about it. But when he's saying that Merkel, and she's not telling the truth either. Like, she's going to try to achieve as much for the German cause as possible while staying within the U.S. colony, right? So if she can get a great gas deal while still inflicting sanctions on Russia, that's what she's going to do, and that's what she did. I Yes, she had no intention, even if she had an intention to keep the Minsk, to force countries to adhere to the Minsk agreement. She couldn't do it. That's not something America could ever allow to happen, because ultimately America decides what happens in Ukraine, not Germany.
Yes, and touching on what you were saying with Putin, let's just say, for lack of a better word, feigning shock, it, of course, you do have to read between the lines. These people are politicians, and that's just the way politics played. I'm not going to say it's no different, but when you look at the concept, it's the exact same thing of what you get in the American political sphere, where
Yeah,
people, again, words have different meanings. They shift things around. It's a lot of a pill pull once again. But
it's based on the everyday guy psyche. That's
yes,
what it is.
yes, and I was just
That's what he's channeling. When Mitch McConnell pretends like these are all incredible heroic victories, he knows that the average normie will look at it that way, because the normie is not going to invest the amount of time like that you and I
yeah,
do
no, not
to
not everyone's
these shows.
autistic like us, but
Yeah, and
but
it's the same thing with Putin, right? He can't say, well, we were really weak. What did you expect me to do?
well, and I was actually just about to get to that because it plays good for a domestic audience, as if Russia was being this very conciliatory power, which in a way they were. I'm not going to say that it was completely disingenuous, but Russia being this very conciliatory power, but it constantly got its hand slapped whenever it tried to do a handshake. That plays well at home. That also plays well with countries that are on the fence or neutral. Say, for example, a country like India is looking at the situation from an outsider's perspective, looking at where, well, Russia did try to build bridges with Germany, with Europe, etc., and this is how they were responded to, and this comes out. So, needless to say, it was and still is a massive game of politics.
Right. Like, if Russia could have created an era that was before Maidan, and that's the way it would go, Russia would have been happy with that. The only time Putin threatened the U.S. and NATO was when NATO had the meeting in 2008 in Hungary, um, outlining that Ukraine would eventually be in NATO, and Putin said, "Don't do that. I will take. If you do that, I will take back Crimea." That was a very definitive, pragmatic statement on his part that had no illusions whatsoever.
And as we
So
saw, it was a red line that was actually enforced.
yes, and I think this was one of the like I think that we'll get to the neocons, but I think the neocon strategy was Russia's going to fold. It's too weak. We do the Maidan, and the Russian fleet will have to go elsewhere, and that'll be that. It'll be over. Uh, Maybe they'll have to circle all the way around the Mediterranean and go to St. Petersburg, or some of the ships will hang out in Syrian ports, but that will be it. And that was a miscalculation, but I think they were also prepared for Russia occupying Crimea as well. Not as well prepared as they would have liked to have been, but nonetheless, that taking back Crimea was always a contingency plan as well.
Yeah, and I really do want to do a retrospective on 2000s European Russian relations and really go deep into that. I do want to dedicate an episode to that sometime in the near future, where you did see this NATO expansion around the time 2004 2008, when you saw the possibility of a real Paris Berlin Moscow axis, and you could even say in the vision of somebody like a De Gaulle starting to form, when you had the initial agreements to Nord Stream, when you had this really, it did seem to be an overcoming of hurdles between at least continental Europe and Russia, where it seemed like a new cooperative era was starting to come about. But then you had the subsequent NATO expansions, you had the Maidan, whatever. Like I said, I want to take some time to uh, go deeper into that. But it was also around the time the neocons had a lot of wind behind their sails. They thought the entire world was going in their favor. And although they knew the risk that Crimea might get occupied, at the time they weighed their options and they thought it was a risk worth taking if it meant knocking Russia into irrelevance. That it's certainly worth expanding NATO, bringing Ukraine
Yeah,
and bringing Georgia. And they were very. I don't even want to call it overconfident, because I could see from their perspective looking at it why their line of decisions would have been very rational if that was your goal. Once again, I don't agree with that goal, but just standing in their shoes, it was a very rational line of thought.
yeah. It's also the neocons also like to gamble, right?
Oh, they love it.
So it was a gamble, and it doesn't matter how many past gambles did not work out for them. Um, they will still gamble. Some of that is driven by a knowledge that um, the post-Soviet world and China are very different spaces now than they were then, and that gradually China will have to be dealt with. So even remember I said way back that part of the reason America left Afghanistan is to make sure that it had funds to sponsor Ukraine. And Blinken recently had said so as much. Um, but I think to get back to Putin, I think Putin has always known that eventually NATO will go for it in Ukraine. And the strategy, one way or another, has been to reserve as many of his troops for what he, I think, fears is a much greater battle. And in the speeches, essentially, when he was talking to the military staff, 15,000 altogether at the Russian Military Collegium, or when those messages are relayed to the general Russian public, one of the things he made very clear was that Russia is at war with NATO, and the expressed um, uh, goal of NATO is to break up Russia, which has been published in various periodicals really for the last 30 years. So it's nothing new, but it's kind of that think tank language that never really makes it um, to the 6 o'clock news anywhere in the world. Maybe there will be a guest on a news hour or an editorial piece on the weekend where this individual is in one of those think tanks or was a former member of those think tanks, and they'll give you the rough
Yeah,
outline.
somebody who dumbs it down for the general populace, and not
Yes,
only dumbs it down, but gives a very, very disingenuous view of it. And
right.
it again, the typical talk show experts. These are the people who are on like daytime CNN and, like you said, write the weekend columns. Kind of the stuff where they can say they put it out there, but so the general public doesn't see it. And by the off chance that they do, it feeds right into what they want them to believe.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham is a prime example of this, especially recently, right?
Yeah,
I mean, he basically says now he couches it in an argument about freedom, and freedom and democracy in America is like a religion. It's a much stronger religion than the inclusion of Christianity within its um, syncretism. So um, you can sometimes, if you peel some of the layers off, you can see it in Lindsey Graham. I mean, other times he's blunt. He wants regime change in Russia, and that's what this war really is about: is a regime change, and ultimately the dismantling of Russia. And this has been a long process. So the war in Yugoslavia was the lead up to that. It was the preparation ground for it. The expansion of NATO um, continued on afterwards. Not that that wasn't happening in the 90s. It was in 97 in particular. But all, the last 25 years, the last quarter of a century is to was all that work was to get to where we are now. And I think, although I don't recall Putin saying it as bluntly, that is the conclusion you have to come away with when he gives all the evidence of the lead up to the war. That is ultimately the conclusion you have to come to. So I think troops in Belarus are to dissuade a possible Polish incursion, maybe in Belarus, maybe in Western Ukraine. I don't know about the Western Ukraine part. I think that Belarus, politically speaking, is not as safe as Russia is, and for that reason, I think even if there were an invasion from the north, from Belarus into Ukraine, it would not include Belarusian forces because I think Belarus is unstable, politically speaking, to enter a war. Um, and that's just I cannot see them risking that unless
Lukashenko was on the
this.
brink just a little over 2 years ago, August
That's right.
2020. I not going to say it looked almost certain he was going to fall, but there was a very real possibility we could have had a Maidan situation in Belarus. And I think, frankly, had it not been for the Maidan and showing Russia the warning signs and what happens if intervention doesn't happen within a swift manner, as well as the situation in Kazakhstan at the beginning of this year, that Belarus and Kazakhstan, respectively, would have taken a similar path to Ukraine.
Right, right. That is part of this long strategy that the West has embarked on ever since it saw that by 2000 that Russia was not going to disintegrate and was actually economically just in the beginning of reconstructing and reconstituting itself. We also shouldn't forget that it is not Russia that went to China to work out a long strategy for economic ties and development. It was China that did that, and Russia went along with it. And we've discussed this on the show before, back in the spring and summer. That process really started as early as '96, and yeah, so it's not really a Primakov was even involved in that. So it's not really like the way it's portrayed in Western media.
Oh, the way it's portrayed in Western media, I can think of no other word for it than just absolutely schizophrenic. There are people, and I sometimes I do this for fun. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. I'll go to the current events section of just any bookstore, and you look through some of the things right there. Any of the geopolitical analysis, especially related to Europe and or Russia, you read that it is just a schizophrenic diatribe. They think that not number one, Putin is this KGB mastermind who, despite only being a lieutenant colonel stationed in East Germany, managed to groom Trump
As a
to take.
lawyer.
Yes, as a lawyer, managed to groom Trump to take power in the U.S. eventually, and was also plotting the downfall, and is going to use Serbia as a jumping point to destroy democracy in the Balkans, and then use that in order to push. It is the most incoherent class. Like I've read pieces written by dyed-in-the-wool neoconservatives, and as stupid as they are, they have at least a tenuous connection to reality. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But these things that make the New York Times bestseller list, the things that get put to the general public, that sort of the pop geopolitics. I'll put it. You got the pop science, you got the pop history. I'm sure, especially people who watch this show, know that the complete garbage that gets pushed in those, the complete inaccuracies, if not outright falsehoods that get pushed in those. Well, there's pop current events as well, and it is arguably the most egregious of the three because it is something that actually colors somebody's perception of what's happening in the world as of the current moment, and it's insane. Instead of having a very, let's just say, realistic view of this,
Yeah.
they do believe that this is some sort of 40-year plot on Putin's part in order to somehow resurrect the Soviet Union and use Donald Trump to destroy America because he makes mean tweets and is a philanderer and has had affairs and whatever. It is the most insane. Once again, that's something I need to just dedicate an episode, a show to, or whatever, write a piece about it, just to delve completely into this. But I'll spare you that for now. And on the topic of Russia, I do have some news about the newest EU sanctions package. If you're ready to get in that, if you don't have anything else related to Russia,
Yeah.
Ukraine, or Belarus. So,
No, that's it.
in light of the, let's see, ninth sanctions package, there was a massive feud regarding food and fertilizer exemptions. Now, you had the usual suspects, such as Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Estonia, saying that this is just a Trojan horse to allow Russia to skirt the sanctions by allowing food and fertilizer to get in. Now, eventually, they did reach a half baked compromise where, of course, these vitals actually did get to go through. And this also touched on during the dispute, Lavrov was saying, well, it's not necessarily Europe or the Western world who will have to suffer because of this. It's much of the non-Western world, the developing world, that is reliant on our food exports, on our fertilizer exports. Although, I do get the feeling that, of course, that is a bit of a downplay. You do look at the avenues of trade and who's relying on what between the different European powers. While they're not wholly reliant on Russian food and fertilizer, it still is a major part of their industry. Again, as I was talking about earlier, you had this movement in the early 2000s towards an integration between the two. That was the goal of a lot of people in Europe and a lot of people in Russia. So you still do have some remnants of that left over. But eventually the EU came to a decision. It allowed the exemptions, but the ninth sanction package, there's been more sanction packages than mobilizations since the start of this war. And there will likely be many more sanction packages. I don't know how many more Ukrainian mobilizations there'll be, but I do think it's funny that they've managed to keep roughly a one for one. Like I said, we're a little bit ahead in sanction packages, but it does seem like they do coincide each other. So if we got a Ukrainian mobilization for the new year, that wouldn't shock me. But we are approaching. Well, in fact, we're actually had just started winter, and for those of you in North America, like us,
Yes.
you're getting your first real taste of winter. The weather is uh,
It's abysmal. Oh my
it's very
gosh.
harsh here. I'll just put it that way. The only place there's a corner of southern Florida, which is pretty much the greater Miami area, where it's like still it was in the 80s today. I definitely don't envy them. I wouldn't trade places with anyone in Miami right now, but that's aside the point. As for Europe, of course, they haven't gotten their vortex, but it is projected this winter is going to be a frigid one, so we will see how that turns out going forward. you have the continued deindustrialization of Europe on that note, and it is, of course, coming out of Germany. And with that being put on there, you do have the Vice Chancellor of Germany, Habeck, saying that the gas cap can be subject to change depending on the needs of Germany and European nations as we move forward into the next few months, which is a bit of a tacit admission, at least in my opinion, that they are expecting a very harsh winter. And I mean, it's just sad. And it was, I believe it was something in the tech industry. I believe it was Dell Computers, one of the big computer companies that actually, they didn't say they were pulling out, but they said they were going to halt the construction of a facility in Germany, which, as time goes on, as the situation worsens, that will likely become, we are relocating that facility to somewhere in the U.S. or China or Japan or wherever. But that does continue. Probably the biggest news out of Europe this week, aside from the Kosovo issue, which I'll get into in a little bit here, are these protests ongoing in France. So there was a terrorist attack at a some Kurdish organization based out of France,
Hmm.
one of these political lobbies, and of course, one of the first fingers pointed at was somewhat reasonably saying these attacks were linked to the Turkish state, but there was a shooting involved with that, which led to Kurds taking to the streets and what can really only be described as riots. And it was wild.
Apparently, three were killed, including like a famous Kurdish singer.
Yeah, I did see that, and it was wild because these are probably the most active protests I've seen in France, honestly, since the Yellow Vests. And these are
Hmm.
over a foreign ethnic grievance. And as for the singer, it was I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation of this, but it was Mir Pure, who was a Kurdish singer, and this is according to the Rahava network. And these have been all over the place. You have the French riot police out, and this is also getting back to what I was saying about the possible connection to Turkey. You had one of the protesters who was talking to one of the reporters on the ground saying that her anger was directed first and foremost at Erdogan. Quote, "It is anger first directed against Erdogan, but also against France, and we did not protect ourselves. France has been considered complicit in the triple murder of 2013, and nothing has been said or done afterwards." So once again, you have this foreign lobby in a Western country, and on top of that, they are wagging the finger at them for providing inadequate support, despite the fact that their facility is supposed to exist like this in the first place. But I, given what the situation was, would not have expected this large of a backlash, and it is reminiscent of the UK street brawls between the Indians and the Pakistani diaspora communities that happened back in the fall. And it is, once again, it does feel like the news cycle is reverting a bit back to 2018 when it comes to these kind of stories, because while these stories didn't stop, as 2019, 2020 rolled around, especially as things got crazier with 2020 onward, a lot of these sort of stories, even from people in our spheres, fell completely off the radar. And I'm just as guilty of that. I'm just guilty of overlooking these things. But it does seem to be a return to full force, especially as Europe does enter into a more chaotic state and will continue to enter into a more chaotic state over the coming years. That you are seeing these ethnic grievances being brought to the street in full force. And there were other protests across Europe. There were solidarity marches. You had them in Germany and Greece, of course, other areas that have been uh, perhaps receptacle is a bit of a harsh term, but I can't really think of anything better to put. And perhaps it's an accurate term. Who knows? But that have been really the receiving grounds of these sort of movements. So these took me a bit off guard, and perhaps it's because this kind of, let's just say, ethnic turf wars on the streets of Western countries has become something that's just so ubiquitous. I would not have expected something of this kind of response, this large of response. And All things considered, it probably is because of the situation the Kurds do find themselves in right now with Operation Clawsword going on in Iraq and Syria, where they are very riled up. Even the diaspora is very riled up at this moment and are operating on what is more or less a hair trigger.
Yeah, you know, just to highlight something else that has been mentioned recently in Europe, this coming from Germany. About a year or so ago, Germany made statements about how it was going to rebuild itself militarily, to deal with the Russian threat and so on. And just this week, it has scrapped that, right? Um, the economic, and it cited economic reasons for this because they know economically Germany's never going to be capable of achieving anything like that again unless they find a way to get uh, really super cheap gas. And I personally think that, again, if we look at a 25-year history, America never wants to see a Germany succeed as well as Germany did ever again. Uh, so, you know, America now is expecting all these European countries to buy American military hardware that they cannot afford. The only way I can see that Europeans actually achieve this is if they cut social nets. That will only increase chaos, social chaos in Europe if they do that. That isn't to say to take the conversation back to neocons that neocons won't go for broke because they too see a kind of a time limit. It's not just an opportunity that has arisen that they've always wanted. They've waited decades for this, but um, it's also a period while time can allow them to create even more opportunities, right? At the same time, they know that there's a Goldilocks period. And if things start to go really south in Europe, then that period will evaporate. That opportunity will evaporate. And so that's kind of the tug of war that I think we're going to be seeing in Europe going forward.
Well, with that, that does lead me a bit into my next story, which I'll touch on some of the other European news items. But this came to my attention just over the past couple days. This is an unclassified report from the U.S. Inspector General, and it goes over the U.S. aid provided to quote unquote civil society, NGO, and media organizations. And this is just a list of countries within Europe and just the Eurasian area in general, Europe and the former Soviet Union, I'll put it, where it totaled, let's see, about one about 1 billion or so dollars here. And I'm just going to go down the list about the amount of what is more or less foreign propaganda funds being dumped into these various countries. This is from highest to lowest. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, you had approximately 80 million. Latvia, you had approximately 73 mil. North Macedonia, 67 million. Romania, 66 million. Lithuania, 64 million. Kosovo, 61 million. Serbia, 55. Montenegro, 50. Estonia, 48. Bulgaria, 47. Slovenia, 40. Albania, 39. Armenia, 30. Hungary, 17. I would expect Hungary to be higher on the list considering how contentious it is there right now, especially between them and the governing structures of the American Empire. Georgia behind them at 15 million. Croatia at 11 million. Slovakia at 11 million. Ukraine at 10 million. Once again, I would have expected them to be higher. The Czech Republic is at 10 million. Belarus, once again, at a meager 8 million. I would have expected, once again, a little more of that. Uzbekistan, 8. Azerbaijan, 4 million. Poland, 2 million. Kyrgyzstan, 2 million. And then we're getting in the hundreds of thousands results. So you have Greece at 684,000, Kazakhstan at 600,000. I will say Kazakhstan I would have expected higher, as well as Turkey I would have expected higher. They're only at 239 million. and a whopping 239,000, excuse me, and a whopping 75,000 for Malta. So you can tell there's some real movers and shakers in Malta right there. That you could certainly expect the next color revolution in Malta with that 75,000 right there. But that's just a list of a handful of countries, and that is the amount of U.S. funds being dumped into each when it comes to NGOs and media influence. So,
Is interesting is that Putin brought up in the recent speeches the role of NGOs in Russia, and
I had missed that one, and it didn't have listing for funding for Russia, but I can imagine. Get
it's probably zero.
Yeah, I was about to say, given the outbreak of the war, they have taken a much harder approach rather than civil societies and NGOs. But yeah, I missed that part of the Putin speech. So if you want to get a little
Yeah,
more into detail
well,
about that.
yes. So Putin even said that during the Soviet era, Russian universities already had subversive elements tied to Western NGOs, and that they must root all of this out now. Um, I would say that like Russia during the 90s was very naive, right? Um, this is why I think even
And
Putin
desperate.
and desperate, why even Putin in the early part of his career still had hopes that that Russia could be part of NATO, right? And this was always laughed at. I don't know if it ever occurred to him that the reason it was laughed at it was because no, we're what we're doing to Yugoslavia, we're going to have to do to you, right? So I think now he finally understands that. But to be fair, I think he's probably understood that for probably since some time after Maidan, and in a very real way. He's probably had advisors. Maybe he doubted them. Now, all of this is conjecture, but I would say it's safe to say that after Maidan, he absolutely understands this because it's for the first time that he's relaying this message to the general Russian public, right? Um, because I think that's the other thing that I think the American we have to sort of look deeply at all the kinds of projections that have been done by the West. Like when the West says Russia's running out of missiles, they mean they're running out of missiles. When Russia is saying that their soldiers are demotivated, what they're really saying is the Ukrainian soldiers are even more demotivated. When they're saying that um, Russia's repressing protests, what they're saying is Ukraine is really repressing protests on a completely different scale, because they'll kill you if you're presented a problem. Even America, when it pulled out of Afghanistan, they had I forget his name. He was a Marine or something, and he criticized how botched it was, and he went to jail. So so all states will do this, but I would say that a lot of this is always projection. Russia's economy will collapse 3 months max. Uh, it's actually Ukraine's economy that has collapsed, and it is Europe's economy that is collapsing, and
Yes,
it
and
is
also
America that will
serves
have to.
as a reassurance to the general public that don't worry, just bear with it a little more because Russia's almost defeated, and that especially in Europe, that's the
Yes,
narrative being fed. It's okay if we can just brave this winter, we can win democracy for Ukraine or whatever, or make sure that Russia doesn't invade your country, or make sure that
yeah,
Putin gets overthrown, or whatever the narrative of the day may be.
right, right. So every time it's actually a projection of their own situation, right? The other thing that Putin mentioned in his speech was, we're really surprised. The economy is actually doing much better than we thought. Um, Growth has slowed down, GDP 2.5%, but everybody in the West said it would be somewhere between 12 to 20%, like massive, massive decrease. And that hasn't happened. And again, there was not the sort of unity that exists now back in 2014 for this to have happened. which brings me to the next point that Putin made was we have the funds, we can do this. Now he's going to increase the size of the military from 1 million to 1.5 million, and he's there reassuring them that um, we can do this. This is not going to dramatically disturb your life, and it's a necessary thing because we are at war with the West, with NATO, with the U.S., and it has to be done because they're non-negotiable. I think you could see Lavrov in the lead up to the war um, said about the U.S. that it is agreement impossible or worse to that effect. But we still strive to do this. And I do think part of the reason they still strive to do this is because the Russians are so historically minded. Like for them, there's a lot of institutions that are still valid that for the U.S. are no longer valid. And they haven't been valid for a very long time because of notions about American exceptionalism and unilateral actions. So they go through the motion. I guess for the historical sake of saying we tried, and again as a primer for the Russian public. But yeah, so those are, and again to come back to Blinken's message that they left Afghanistan. The decision by the Biden administration to leave Afghanistan, I believe, was in April. And it was before the Geneva meeting between Putin and Biden, which was in June.
Yes,
Also,
and of course the framework for that had been underway throughout the Trump years, but the when it was actually decided, when they actually put pen to paper and said this is definitively going to be happen, was April.
yes, and notice that it was also in April that the Ukrainians began shelling Donbass. I mean, they never stopped, but uh, uh, in a much profound way. They started shelling Donbass in
And you
April
also
of
had the threats to the water in Crimea and the initial Russian buildup in April 21.
yes, that's right. Somewhere along the line, right at this time in April 2021, someone said, "We don't have the funds to do this. Like, we're going to have to focus on Afghanistan, which they weren't really doing a good job of, and then we'll deal with Russia. But we don't have the funds for both. We can't focus on both these fields right now." So, also, I think if they were still going to go along with the pullout out of Afghanistan and the war started in April 2021, um, it optically would have looked very bad for the Americans. So they had to take Afghanistan on the chin and then wait almost a year later, 10 months later. So
And it's even still coming back to haunt them because there was a piece put out by The Hill that, if we're going to boil down to what it really means and cut through a lot of the nonsense, saying, well, when is the U.S. going to end up abandoning Ukraine like it did Afghanistan? Now, this could just be
yeah,
something they put out there to instill that fear that we can't abandon Ukraine like we abandoned Afghanistan, but it
right,
is
right.
something that still does haunt them and something that will still follow them around. But it it was an interesting piece if you want to actually sludge through it. It's you might get a little bit out of it, but if you choose to skip it,
Funnily
you're not
enough,
missing much.
I totally agree with you. But funnily enough, um, I think the outcome in Ukraine doesn't concern the average American any more than Afghanistan did. In fact, I would say less. Um, and I think that might be another reason why they keep bringing up Afghanistan because America was in Afghanistan for so long, and it's tied to 9/11. It's tied to the funding of the Mujahideen uh, as well. So they have, optically on paper, they have a longer history. Although, again, Putin does mention that the extremist nationalism of Ukraine was fostered in Ukraine even during the time of the Soviet Union. So that was another interesting admonition on his part. Um, he even referenced a Russian writer who said, if you want to destroy Russia, include Galicia within the Soviet Union, which is what um, um, Stalin did. And this kind of bucks against the idea that Ukrainians, their nationalism was fostered by the Holodomor. It wasn't. It predates the Holodomor by several generations.
Yeah, and
And
especially with the area, the cradle Ukrainian nationalism within Galicia, you look at where the Holodomor actually happened, it was the predominantly ethnic Russian parts of eastern Ukraine, or what is today eastern Ukraine.
yes, Central and Eastern Ukraine, yes. And really, it was the Austro-Hungarians and later the Germans, prior and during World War One, that fostered this nationalism, right? And the thing that, I mean, what goaded them was the Ukrainian nationalists is that for them the Russians took away their identity because for them they are the real Russians. The Ukrainians are not the Russians, right? Um, and that's what that boils down to. So it predates even World War One, but it really starts to take off around World War One. Anyhow, so there were a lot of things that Putin said during the speech. I hate to pepper it this way, but maybe that's not so bad as we talk about other things in a way that gives a much fuller picture of the situation.
Yes, and just getting back to some of the stuff with Afghanistan, because we brought it up, I do want to just take a little bit more of a diversion before I get back into our European news in full. Is that speaking of the ghost of Afghanistan still haunting America, you had all these weepy mainstream media pieces about the last girls' school in Afghanistan has closed and that women are no longer allowed in secondary and higher education, which it does make me wonder that how many how many areas in Afghanistan did this actually take effect? Because they do paint the Taliban as if it was this very radical takeover, as if it had displaced some sort of burgeoning Jeffersonian democracy
It
instead
was just like
of
when Trump took over.
just like when Trump took over. It's exactly the same. Donald Trump is the Taliban. You heard it here first on the War Report. Yeah, you heard it here. Yeah, if you heard it here first, I don't know where the hell you've been for the past what 6 7 years at this point. But with that, it does make me wonder. Just a bit of an aside. When it came to the areas operated by U.S. backed Muslim warlords, are we supposed to believe that their social attitudes and their cultural attitudes were that drastically different of the Taliban? And it does make me wonder. I still haven't gotten to the bottom of it because, of course, it just happened. But that's twice within a week you have significant pieces coming out of the mainstream media invoking, as I've termed it, the ghost of Afghanistan. And
Hmm.
I can imagine it's going to maybe it's going to be something of an inverse of Vietnam, where Vietnam made the American public very conflict averse for several years afterwards, where because of the humiliation in Afghanistan, they will use that failure to gin up American support for, once again, nonsense Ukraine or Taiwan or wherever conflict needs to be ginned up, perhaps Iran or really just anywhere the U.S. wants to intervene. And I can only imagine that these are the first two of many pieces that are going to constantly invoke the Taliban in Afghanistan and the American failure and why we have to do better next time and how we have a duty to X, Y, and Z people to secure whatever for them. So it's not that newsworthy, but I thought it was worth bringing up from that perspective. And I can't
Hmm.
imagine we've seen the light of this end of this tunnel anytime soon, and that it will be something that is used to browbeat the American populace over the next several years, especially as the situation in Europe does turn worse, and especially as the situation in East Asia also gets more volatile.
Yeah. I have thought how would a NATO involvement or a NATO light involvement. I mean, there already is a NATO light involvement in Ukraine, but I am convinced that um, because I think Americans are still actually very adverse to fighting this conflict themselves, even though I think neocons will push for it. What they will do is they will push like America in a leading role with Poland and Romania and Latvia and Lithuania enter Ukraine. Something to that effect.
Yeah, and you're already starting to see the inverse of that build, especially with the China situation, where you see Japan starting to push a military expansion now and trying to once again get rid of the clause in the Constitution that prevents them from building a proper military, where it is going to be that joint U.S., Japanese, Taiwanese leadership against Chinese expansionism and the influence of China in Asia or wherever else. And this also coincides with Lloyd Austin's comments from the past week and a half or so about him talking about Russia and China are serving to be a destabilizing force, quote unquote, in Africa as they continue to invest more, which is the once again the biggest projection I've ever seen. And
Yeah.
not to sing the praise of Russia or China too much because I understand their nations like any other. They have their flaws, whatever. Getting all the disclaimers out of the way. When it comes to the actual money they've put in there, the the narrative they try to build around it is you just have Russia and China acting like these monsters who are coming in acting like loan sharks. But it does return once again to that one Twitter exchange that has probably become one of my favorites of, well, when the Chinese come, we get a hospital. When the British come, we get nothing more than a lecture. Well, how do you think you're going to have to pay for that the hospital? And there you have it, the lecture.
This the
But
lecture. They
but once
literally
again,
can't help themselves.
you have actual tangible investment and development of these countries, much in the spirit of say 19th, 20th, early 20th century European colonialism, where you actually have the building of what at least should be long-lasting structures if properly maintained, and really, and if, I know that this would gain the ire of a lot of the very anti-colonialist crowd, who seems to coincidentally enough be some of the biggest supporters of the American Empire. If you ever noticed that little
Yeah.
quote unquote contradiction, although it's far from contradictory, it makes perfect logical sense that it actually serves to a raising of living standards in these countries, and honestly, the exact opposite, more stability in these countries,
Yes.
and and this is probably the part that disgusts the U.S. the most, is that the country investing in it actually, whether that be Russia, China, whoever, actually sees tangible benefits coming out of their investment and actually gets to take a little bit off the top for the services that they do provide. But I figured I would mention that before cleaning up the rest of our European news. If you have anything to add on to that, certainly feel free to.
Yeah, I will just say that Russia and China investing in Africa to make it a more stable continent is depriving Europe of diversity, and that's ultimately what they're up to.
They're just yes, they're depriving Europe of the people who are going to pay their pensions, take care of their elderly. They are depriving Europe of their future demographics. How dare they? How absolutely
But if you raise their living standard, they won't want to come to Europe.
it's disgusting. It's deplorable, and frankly, Europe just needs to counteract by opening the floodgates, letting all those refugees in Turkey, and you know what? That'll really show Russia and China.
Oh yeah.
I I shouldn't joke about that because that probably is what's going to end up happening at some point in the near future. So I probably
Yeah.
shouldn't take this so lightly, but I can't help myself. But getting back to Europe, the poor, poor continent, our poor, poor mother Europe, to embrace some of the early 2016, 2017 rhetoric, if you'll allow me. Getting back into
Yeah.
that, um, you have less well-known protests in France this week, and protests that got less of a spotlight on them is Le Pen and her political allies led an anti-NATO march this week.
Hmm.
Out
Yeah, I
of the
saw
most
that.
interesting part of Europe, you have Orban urging Europe not to get further involved in Ukraine and that it has already cost them enough and they have nothing to gain from going further into Ukraine.
And he had
And
that speech he sent me where
yes,
he mentions several hundred Hungarian minorities have already died fighting for Ukraine.
yes, and I was actually just about to get into that speech, and I'll just read some this direct excerpt from it here. So he says we should not get involved in this war no matter what, and then he continues on to say, in reason because our neighboring country, in our neighboring country, it's somebody who speaks English as a second language translated this, so please bear with me. In reason because in our neighboring country, many Hungarians live, and in part because the war is always bad. Every day people are dying. hundreds of Hungarians have also died. Those that have been conscripted by the Ukrainian army. So you can tell, and of course, there's putting on a projection for the general public when you're giving a speech as a politician. But you can tell a genuine, I wouldn't exactly call it anger, but you can tell there's a negative emotion that Orban actually
Yeah.
does feel some sort of negative emotion, whether that be frustration or sadness or anger, over the fact that ethnic Hungarians have suffered as a result of Ukrainian policy both before and during this war. And you do see this continuing, and with some of the dust up in Slovakia, because there were also anti NATO protests out of Slovakia this week, you have in relation, I mean, Slovakia, which is the country with one of the most populous Russian populations, Ukraine being the only one larger, and that's the Eastern Slavic group that is probably about probably only a couple million of them, but they're
Yeah.
they're the forgotten Eastern Slavs, where most of
Yeah.
them
They're
are.
they're dotted all through like parts of Ukraine, Slovakia, and Serbia,
Yeah, and then
and particularly in the Vojvodina region.
yeah, and then
Uh,
there's about 500,000 who emigrated to the U.S.
Yeah.
In the early 20th century.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're an intriguing little group, but they've also been subject to the Ukrainian language laws. When a lot of people talk about that, they say, "Oh, of course, it's countering Russian influence," and I mean that reason's nonsense in and of itself, considering the fact that ethnic Russians have been there for uh, as long, if not longer, than the Ukrainians have
You
been
know, they're
there.
an interesting case because one of the arguments that Western Ukrainian nationalists, Galician nationalists use is, well, we're the original Rus, we're not those Mongols. And the Ruthen also will say that we are. We got out of there to escape the Mongols, but they've always had fairly good relations with the Russians. Always.
Oh, it was actually a center of very Russophilic feelings
Yes.
in the 19th and early 20th century in the lead up to World War One. In fact, you actually had an Austrian-led ethnic cleansing of these people because of these sympathies that they have with Russia. And I mean,
Yes.
like I said, they're an interesting ethnic group in and of themselves. I could probably do an entire episode on.
And Andy Warhol is one of these, but one of these people. Although um, I think he was like part of the Catholic Church or the Greek Catholic
Yeah, I
Union
was actually
Church.
just about to get into the religious division. So many of them, because of the politics of the region at the time, were Uniats, which are Eastern Christians under Rome. Their traditions, once again, they're almost identical to the Orthodox, except the only thing they have in common with the Catholics is that they submit to the authority of Rome. But that's not to say that there aren't any Orthodox populations. A very tenuous split, and it is interesting because whenever they're out of the orbit of the Catholic world, whether they are in Russia, whether they're in the U.S., which is a Protestant or quote unquote pluralistic country, they almost always abandon union with Rome. That's just an interesting, just
Yeah.
like little piece of like
A church
ethnography.
I
And
used to attend to had two guys who were, they literally said, we're Rus and we're Carpathan Rus.
yeah, that
That's what they literally said to me.
yeah, that's another ethnic name they use. Carpatho-Rusin and Ruthenian might be the other one you hear for the
Yep.
ones who are more, let's just say, oriented to the west, especially the Uniots. But like I said, they're an interesting little ethnic group. But they've also borne the brunt of Ukraine's ethnic policy, and arguably even worse. I would say, okay, because of the nature of the war in Donbass and the shelling, I would say out of all the ethnic minorities in Ukraine, the Russians have borne the brunt of it. But I would say after that, I mean, you have the Rusins whose identity is completely erased because the Ukrainian census takers will say, no, you're Ukrainian, you're Western Ukrainian, you speak Ukrainian, you're just like us, trying to completely marginalize them as just distinct people. And like I said, that those laws also affect Hungarians, which Orban was referring to, the Slovak and Polish populations, and the Romanian populations. So outside of really the Poles and the Baltics, you do see this movement, especially throughout Eastern and Central Europe, where although these people in Hungary or Romania or wherever may not have exactly made their peace with Russia, while they still may hold a lot of that ethnic animus over the past few centuries, their feelings towards Ukraine are no more positive. And aside, once again, from Poland, Poles, Georgians, and Balts, nobody's really willing to throw themselves into the Ukrainian meat grinder on their behalf. So, now, I'm not saying that the policy of the Slovak government or the Romanian government, whoever, really pretty much any country in Europe but Hungary, will change towards Russia. The people, from a grassroots level, as much as that actually counts, have seemed to reach their limit with this war, going back just to the ethnic politics of it.
And while we're still talking about Hungary, the EU has denied Hungary a $22 billion package because of Orban's treatment of LGBTQ people and LGBTQ rights. So
Wow, that's
there you have it. That's like, you're really hard on our little subversive janissaries that we make sure are activated wherever our empire stretches, and for that you're going to pay.
ladies and
Because
gentlemen, the LGBTQ CIA strikes
yeah,
again.
literally.
People always thought I was joking with that term, but just over the past few years, I feel rather vindicated in
Yeah.
that, just personally speaking, because we've been saying that on the show since about 2019. That look, you thought it was a joke, it's not. And going back into those NGO funds that we rattled off, where do you think that money is going when it comes to NGO and media? How much of that do you think is pro LGBTQ CIA organization outlets? I bet you a large section of it is. Now,
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't seen a broken down figure showing this much goes to this, but look, if I had to wager a guess, I mean, I would say a significant amount at the very least, if not a majority, is going there. But the last few pieces of news I have out of Europe is you have Croatia refusing to train members of the armed forces of Ukraine, refusing to subject themselves to that. Croatia has been another one of these countries that you would have initially expected to be very much behind the Ukrainian cause, but over the past several months have shown themselves to be less than eager to go along with this. Now, by no means have they been pro Russia in this conflict, but they certainly have not been pro Ukraine. I would say after Hungary, they're probably the least pro Ukraine country, at least policy wise, in Europe at the moment.
Yeah, if you ignore Serbia, I would
Yeah,
say
I mean, Serbia's
Hungary,
is.
yeah, yeah. Hungary, Croatia, and Slovakia are, and I, you know, uh, would really rather not have any part of this. But I would say also Bulgaria,
And
both
Austria.
Bulgaria and Slovakia, their governments have fallen, and anti-NATO sentiments were always there, but they have increased. Croatia has been the surprise, I think. I'm just as surprised as you are, but yeah, Milanovic, their prime minister, I believe, because they have a prime minister and a
He's
president.
the president.
He's the president. Sorry. Um, yeah, he said, "Why would I want to train the Ukrainians in Croatia so I can make Russia an enemy?" Um, what's America doing? Are they defending? Are they in Ukraine defending Ukraine?
Yeah, so it was a it was a very interesting little piece, and
Balkan realism,
yeah.
right there.
I mean, you had the agreements between Hungary, Austria, and Serbia. I think that was also expanded later to Croatia, where you do see this marginalization of the V4 bloc, where because Poland and the Czech Republic have been so fervent to the mainline European foreign policy, they have isolated countries like Slovakia and Hungary, which have led them both to look to other neighbors such as Serbia and Austria, forming an interesting, you could almost say, Balkan bloc. And as you
Uh-huh.
said, you can stretch that down into even Bulgaria, depending on how far you want to stretch that definition. But it does show while these countries aren't necessarily willing to embrace Putin and meet him and shake his hand and maybe, let's just say, have an Orban style relationship with Putin, that these countries, and I'm not just talking about public sentiment, I'm talking about actual policy decisions, are breaking away from the mainline European foreign policy on this. And while none of them are great movers and shakers, this isn't exactly a France or a Germany we're talking about. When you get smaller countries that one by one start to peel away at this, the efforts towards this war become much more hampered.
Hmm. Hmm.
But with that, while we are in the Balkans, we do have some news out of Serbia involving Kosovo. Now, I touched on this briefly last episode because the situation was still developing, but the protests do continue throughout the Serbian ethnic parts of Kosovo. And you had Vucic making some cryptic statements about how there were some countries that have said to him in private that they plan on withdrawing recognition from Kosovo. Now, nobody was publicly named in this. You had some speculation in the Serbian media that Egypt might be one of these countries, and so take that for what it's worth. You have the situation continuing to escalate and troop buildups, and there are barricades being erected on the border with North Kosovo between Kosovo authorities and areas with ethnic Serbs. So far, no Serb state involvement within Kosovo itself, but the situation, much like how the other wars in the Balkans have started over the past 30 years, and you could also compare this to a similar situation with the Nagorno Karabakh war in Armenia with Azerbaijan. You see these ethnic pockets that aren't necessarily acting on behalf of the state starting to form their own blocks and form their own movements now. This isn't nearly as militarized is in Nagorno Karabakh yet, but if I had to give a comparable situation to what this could turn into, I would say that much because you have Kosovo, which is de facto independent now. Of course, I wouldn't say they're a legitimate state by any means. They are a breakaway province, but they do effectively govern themselves insofar as they are a client to the American Empire. But you still do have these pockets along the Serbian border full of ethnic Serbs where you could very easily see a situation where these ethnic groups, who may or may not have ties to the Serbian state proper, do take to arms themselves, like I said, much similar to what we see in Nagorno Karabakh, which is geographically and politically part of Azerbaijan, but in terms of political authority there and ethnic composition is Armenian. So I'm not going to say anything definitive at this point, but I do believe that the coming months and years are leading us to this sort of situation. And when this actually does boil over, really depends on a variety of factors. And I would say actually most of them would be outside of both Serbia and Kosovo and would have to do with the general European landscape over the course of the next 2 years.
Hmm. There is that election. Um, Again, I think this is again, it's about the license plates of Serbs in that region. That's supposed to happen in February of 2023. So I'm expecting, like, I don't know if this is going to remain frozen until February, but I would say that anytime that America feels frustrated with Russia, what they'll do is they'll punch Serbia. It's the way they lash out.
Yes, and it also does have the added benefit for the American Empire of they can take these blows at Serbia, taunt the Russians, and also try to concoct a narrative that Russia isn't coming to your aid. Russia's abandoned you. They're not going to be able to assist you.
Yeah,
You're surrounded by NATO. You might as well just give in now. Where it is, in a large part, that sort of approach as well. So it's a
absolutely.
very two pronged thing. And the situation, like I said, I'm giving it a bit of a larger window here because there always is the possibility these sort of laws get delayed, as we have seen in the past, or these things get put on the back burner because of political considerations. But just in the frame of the next 2 years, especially considering how this war in Ukraine goes in the winter, we could see probably some of the biggest developments in the Balkans we've seen in
Hmm.
about 20 or 30 years happen
Hmm.
in 2023, 2024. And if I had to speculate at the moment, when it comes to the license plate laws and the identification laws, they are going to kick that can down the road as long as they can. February probably won't be the boiling over point for that, but every day it's inevitable. Every day does bring us closer to when this does boil over because it's a matter of when rather than if at this point.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it would. I, I would say like the inclusion of Montenegro and Macedonia in NATO is like they're all nothing burgers. They're all absolutely symbolic. None of these countries can contribute anything. Um, Bulgaria has almost virtually nothing to contribute. It has exhausted almost all the armaments it has that it's donated to Ukraine from the Soviet era.
And keep in mind,
Again,
Bulgaria was a very unique donor to Ukraine because when it came to a lot of the artillery pieces Ukraine was using early in the war, Bulgaria was the only country to still have the ammunition needed to actually be used in those guns. Now, since then, the Ukrainians have received other artillery pieces, but in those early phases of the war, Bulgaria was a crucial component to the Ukrainian war effort.
right. Um, uh, the the Putin speech also mentioned that one shouldn't think that the West has depleted their military reserves. They have not. What they have depleted is the Soviet era equipment that we've destroyed. Again, he's priming them for a possible confrontation with NATO because the Soviet era stuff is going to get used up. And we actually have, I think this was according to Gerasimov, again from some of the meetings, but it's been corroborated by Western press as well. Um, so 350 tanks were given to Ukraine. Uh, Something like 700 to 800 armored vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles. These are armored. They're like they would have been the light tanks of World War II, essentially, but they could carry like besides a crew of two or three, they can carry 5 to 8 personnel for rapid response. Uh, they're no joke. They have like 30, uh, what is it, 30 millimeter cannons on them.
Yeah,
Like,
these were the backbones of the Ukrainian counteroffensives in the late summer, early fall.
yeah. So they're not nothing, right? They are highly effective because they're faster and they can take out infantry and they can actually like they can take out the little bungalows that you see in some of these videos. They can annihilate those things. So and they're just their firing is much more rapid. So hundreds of something like 5 years worth of Stinger missiles. Like the amount of armaments that have been given to Ukraine is like absolutely staggering. But it is coming down to this is why you see Lindsey Graham arguing for gray eagles and give them everything, attack missiles, uh, because they know they're running out of the Soviet era stuff, right? And like you know, I think Bulgaria gave them 2 or 4 planes. We don't know what kind of planes. I know Macedonia gave them 1 MiG. It was literally the only plane that they have. But they but
I
but
don't
they
have
all
these. I don't have these numbers on hand, but you look at the amount of GDP given by some of these European countries, especially some of these smaller Eastern European countries, and
yeah.
it is absurd levels of it. In some cases, like a third of their GDP is going towards aiding Ukraine at this time, and these countries are being completely drained of their
Yeah,
resources, whether that be just military, financial, or anything else really, in order to fuel this war effort.
right. And I think that's another reason why there's many reasons for the Russian slow approach. Um, Not just to preserve as many lives for a much bigger battle that they see as an inevitability, Now, we still don't know if that's going to happen or how it's going to happen. It probably will, like America will probably use Poland and Romania to enter the war. Particularly Poland is more likely than Romania, in my opinion. Um, but the other is, as you say, they're giving up so much of their GDP to help Ukraine, these like small nothing nations. Uh, Macedonia, for instance, gave 30 T-72s and one type of modified T-72, along with that one MiG. And um, but that's all they have, right? And where are they going? How are they going to buy like even just like the updated uh, U.S. Bradley fighting vehicle or I don't know, something that the Germans manufacture? Like, where are they going to get this from, right? Even Germany knows now, like, it cannot build up its military. It's finished, and and we're talking about Germany. Germany before this war was like the fourth largest economy in the world, right? It's like it was not a nothing
It was
burger.
the preeminent power of Europe for as much as that's
Absolutely.
worth, and you even have Poland had depleted a good half of its tank fleet by the summer of this war, just giving it to Ukraine. And there was
Yeah.
a major dispute in the fall, especially around the time of the Ukrainian counteroffensives, as Poland donated more weapons. They demanded a one-for-one replacement with German armor for the
Yeah,
old
that's
Soviet
right.
armor that they were pouring into it. The Germans wanted to settle that uh, on a 3-to-1 ratio because, of course, of the quality of the weapons that when you want a brand new Tiger tank for you expending once T-72, that isn't a really, I guess, fair trade doesn't really mean anything, but it's even to that point just completely incoherent that the Poles are dumping all of this old Soviet, all this old 30, 40-year-old armor into this meat grinder and they're expecting this sort of reimbursement. They expect similar from the U.S. or whoever they're trying to shake down at the time, and I imagine that's a racket that a lot of these other countries that have been big donors to Ukraine have got in on. But once again, you're seeing the purpose of integrating these countries into the European Union and NATO. That they knew something approximating this conflict one day would come, and they knew for the first phase of the conflict, in order to spare the West any pain, especially the U.S. any pain, that these countries will pay the price first, and if not, we'll gradually creep our way westward until the U.S. actually has to get involved in this war, or if they run up the white flag first, whatever. But we're seeing the purpose that nobody expected, say Macedonia
Hmm.
uh, or Montenegro or any of these countries really to be part of the integral strategy for NATO's quote unquote defensive Europe. No, it was so they can give their meager air forces and tank fleets to Ukraine or to whoever in the event of a conflict like this. And that was the purpose. I think a lot of these countries are starting to realize that, at least on the ground level, and even on the policy level, as we discussed a little earlier, with countries like Hungary, which Hungary was actually a significant donor on the outbreak of the Donbass War in 2015. Donated, I think, about 50 tanks to Ukraine on the outbreak of that war.
Hmm.
Now, they haven't gotten really any aid from Hungary since then. But when you have these countries like Hungary, Slovakia, etc., who are at the brunt of that, you even do start to see that trickle up their policy level, that they realize that we are literal meat shields for when the West decides to embark on this really apocalyptic crusade at the behest of the wonderful minds in Washington and Brussels.
Right. And you can see again the projection, right? We've talked extensively about, the projection that Russia um, was going to take over Ukraine in 96 hours. Was really, it wasn't just to set up the, um, let's say the counter to that for not happening, but really it was the West kind of preparing for a quick victory. Um, of Russia. That like ultimately what they needed was regime change. That the easier way for them to get Crimea was for a regime change in Russia, and the way to get regime change in Russia was to have an economic collapse. So um, yes, they like there was extensive buildup. The Americans under the Bush administration gave them, sorry, Bush, the Trump administration um, gave them a ton of weapons, and the 1 year of Biden did as well. But who knows if they had thought that Russia's economy would have been as resilient as it has been, uh, they probably would have had the kind of equipment that they're now thinking should be in Ukraine. Uh, and that would have changed the calibration of the way the Russians would have entered Ukraine trying to get a quick peace deal. So both both countries actually were interested in a very short period of fighting in order to achieve politically what their goals instead of a war of this kind. And yeah, we'll just have to wait and see because after they exhaust the polls, we talked about how they've begun conscripting. Um, so apparently, a famous Polish rock singer has been conscripted. They want an army of 200,000 before the end of spring 2023. Um, Normally, like when I read these things, I'm very speculative. But I did see Southfront had an article about this. That so I tend to believe this. I think Poland is preparing. They too see that this was that what they had hoped would happen did not happen, and that they're going to have to get involved.
Well, just to bolster your point, I do want to point something out here, something I was just about to
Mhm.
bring up, that the Polish government has announced that they would give
Yes.
amnesty to any fighters that have been in Ukraine over the past 8 years. Now, it's not like these people were prosecuted in the first place, but this is actually really reminiscent. Forgive me for making a reference to the World Wars, but you had a similar case where a lot of American volunteers fought with either the British or the Canadians, and upon the American entry into both World War One and World War Two, respectively, they granted general amnesty and actually brought a lot of these people back, especially when it came to pilots and other specialists, to train American forces that were trained to get involved in the war. So, while it may be a bit of a stretch to say it's a one for one, announcing a blanket amnesty for these guys who have been in Ukraine for some of them, maybe even 8 years. I mean, these are the battle-hardened guys that are going to want to build a proper fighting force if they do actually have any serious intention of getting involved in this war. So I would say it isn't something that guarantees they'll get involved, but it is a major sign pointing towards that if they're announcing something like that, especially at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that famous graveyard, cemetery that has been constructed in Poland now, where they're saying themselves is about 1,200 dead Poles just from this year in Ukraine, not all the previous years. Um, and they're all given military honors when they're buried. So that's a lot of ceremony, and this law was inevitable. And as you say, it's not a guarantee, but it does look like uh, this war is going to escalate. That's what it looks like. I can't. Uh, Lindsey Graham was basically outlining what what Brzezinski was saying: subdue Russia in order to contain China, but don't go to China first. So it's I think they feel like if they don't destroy Russia, like they will not be able to compete with China. Like if they're so confident that China is a nothing burger, it's not going to do anything, its economy is going to slow down. Like all those things could be true. Yeah, okay. So they have a demographic problem. Well, I mean, so does the U.S.
So does
Yes,
any
I know.
country worth its salt, frankly. I mean, the only countries that don't have demographic problems are not countries you would want to live in, just to put it very bluntly.
Yes, exactly. In America's population, 1.2 million increased only because of illegal immigration into America, right? And those people are not interested in defending America. They're interested in making bucks and surviving because the kind of hellholes that they come from are just, they're whatever. So
They're interested in
those,
those remittances.
yeah, they're interested in those remittances. They're not going to be in NASA. They're not going to be in MIT. They're not in any kind of think tank.
I mean, they might be, but do they belong there is the real question.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right. We have to think about ethnic quotas and all that stuff.
More
Um,
wise Latinas in NASA, okay?
yes, yeah, it will be a Latina Space Force. Um,
Grand Marshal
AOC
AOC.
AOC will lead it. I mean, like they're setting this up for like AOC running for president in maybe 2028. I kid you not. I think
I
that's where
mean,
it's going.
I'm not shocked. I can't wait for the AOC DeSantis election. That one's gonna be a thrill. I don't know.
Uh,
Maybe Trump, if he doesn't get elected this time around, will be like on a ventilator and like just be like just completely aged and still like trying to run for president now. And man, I could get into some of the Trump 2024 stuff, but I think I'll save that for the retrospective episode to give you my full thoughts on that. But yeah, just to round out our European news, you did have this interesting story, and I say interesting because I mean very confusing, of a gift from Ukraine
yeah, this
ended
is
up
crazy.
causing an explosion at a Polish police headquarters, and it was a package sent back with one of the police commanders that went on a visit to Ukraine, and when he arrived back at the office, he was greeted with an explosion that didn't take any casualties but did cause minor injuries. So the story still doesn't have many details, but this is also reminiscent of some of the strange packages that you got at embassies, whether those be the dismembered animal
Oh
parts
yes,
or the explosion
yes.
or the suspected explosives found at the Ukrainian embassies in both Slovakia and Spain. So you're, I can't necessarily make heads or tails of this, but this is becoming a strange, dare I say, trend, and even trend might be a little bit of a stretch to say the least. But uh, you're getting these now. Whether this was some sort of attempt at a false flag or anything like that, I really could not tell you. But this did happen on December 15th. That's when this was reported by the AP. So whether this was so as to be some sort of pretense, like a Russian agent sent us home who was infiltrated into the Ukrainian forces, whatever. But that was a strange story that did come onto my radar.
My guess is it was Ukrainians.
Oh yes, yes.
Just like it was Ukrainians who launched those S-300 systems um, into Poland that killed those two Polish farmers. Like the whole point, they're desperate, right? They know they need NATO to enter. They know they're on the brink. They know it. They need NATO. They need U.S. troops or they need Polish troops with F-16s, F-15s, Bradleys, and Abrams and Leopard tanks. They need that. They know that they cannot get this land back. Because remember, no matter how bad the Russian losses have been, uh, what Ukraine lost in 2014 has been more than doubled what they've lost so far in 2022. So they're not really taking a lot back, um, and they're desperate to take it back. So there's always going to be some element, particularly in the nationalist wing that of Ukraine, that will try to provoke something in order to keep support for Ukraine, right? Because the public in the West has been prepped. The evil Russians, they're doing all of these horrible, undemocratic things, and we have to defeat them and for Ukraine and so on and so on.
Yes. And that being said, I do have a final piece of Ukraine news that does bleed into U.S. news, and that is Zelensky, after his brave showing in Bakhmut, took an overnight flight to Washington, D.C. to give a speech in front of Congress where congressional leaders, of course, had the Ukrainian flag and they were draping it behind him. And he was giving this very teary eyed speech about how you must support Ukraine, frankly, more brazen than anything even Netanyahu has done. The fact that this man has outdone Netanyahu, of course, it is a fellow co ethnic, but outside of Israel, that is. But, I mean, who else could have outdone Netanyahu
Did,
in that regard?
did he beat BB's standing ovations?
Oh, yeah, yeah, because even that was met with some controversy because if you recall the scandal with that, of course, it was Congress that invited him and not Obama, so that led to a bit of thing. But I mean, this was completely bipartisan. You did have some of the usual suspects, some of the quote unquote MAGA Republicans, like you didn't have like Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or the other woman that isn't Marjorie Taylor Greene, whose name escapes me at the moment. But you had some of the more quote unquote populist types who uh, didn't give the standing ovation or didn't applaud enthusiastically enough, and they made an entire call out list of all of them. So that happened, and of course, more aid was approved to Ukraine, and he was Zelensky was being the welfare queen that he is, and he came in his drab. He came in his olive green. He put on a long sleeve shirt because he knew the weather was going to be a little nippy. But yeah, and then there's some interesting photo ops where let's say. Even with fully grown men, Biden still doesn't quite understand where to put his hands on people. So,
Yeah.
if you've seen that photo, you've seen it. If not, I will not traumatize you with it. But that also coincides with the U.S. passing the defense budget, the National Defense Authorization Act, and within that, you have the amount of the U.S. defense budget for the 2022 fiscal year, that an equivalent amount of that being given to Ukraine. So that's just shy of $800 billion that's been pledged to Ukraine throughout the course of 2023. Whether that will be paid all at once or paid in installments, depending on whatever agreement they made, I don't know. But this was a $1.7 trillion bill that went to the usual suspects. But once again, of that, about 800 billion of that 1.7 trillion is going to the Ukrainian war effort. And that is on top of that $1.7 trillion bill. Of course, you have McConnell coming out after uh, this whole little, let's just say, circle of or whatever it was, this disgusting little display, and you have McConnell saying, providing assistance for Ukraine to defeat Russia is the number one priority of the United States, according to most Republicans. That's how we see the challenges confronting our country at this moment. And that coincides with a piece today put out by Wall Street Journal, so take that for what you will, that U.S. life expectancy has fallen to the lowest levels it has since 1996. And they attribute opioid overdoses and effects from COVID 19. Now, how much of that is actual illness versus the cascading effects of our response to said illness, I think that would be interesting to look into. But of course, this article doesn't delve too much into the secondary effects of that, such as our very, let's just say, drastic responses to such things. So, as I'm sure you all know, life expectancy is just one of the key factors you can look at and determine just the health of the country. If it's staying stable or going up, things are good. If it's going down, things are not only bad, but very bad. And it was admittedly only a minor drop from 70. It dropped from 2020, it was at 77 years old for the average American adult, and to 2021, with the most recent statistics we compiled, that dropped down by 6 tenths of a year to 76.4 years. So, like I said, admittedly, it's not that big of a drop, but when you consider the fact that's over the average of some 330 million Americans and the various effects and how accurate, how those numbers, given how American census data works, are probably an understatement of the situation going on right now. And when you also break it down by specific demographics and communities, the people who are probably most impacted by this. And as we've seen, especially with the opioid epidemic, it is likely those white Heartlander Americans who are going to be at the forefront of this decline in life expectancy and decline in standard of living. But that is all on top of about 800 billion to Ukraine, on top of a 1.7 billion dollar quote unquote defense budget bill, as the actual composition of the nation falls into what is arguably a state of disrepair at this point. I'm not too optimistic about the future of the American public. Now, but as we were saying, of course, there will always be more remittance Americans to fill that gap. So fear not. It doesn't matter that
Yeah,
our core stock in the nation, because remittance Americans can run the empire, as we all know.
yeah, and remittance Americans will go and defend Ukraine. The whole point of the Maidan Revolution was to cause a color revolution in Ukraine that would later catch fire in Russia. And I think a lot of this funding, nearly half a trillion, I mean, not a nearly, more than half a trillion, is really to prop up the Ukrainian economy, which is, it doesn't exist. Uh, Again, another projection, right? Russia's economy is collapsing. Oh, actually, it's Europe and Ukraine. Um, in the short term, Ukraine is not going to get the kind of arms that it had wanted. Uh, I think eventually it will, but it got one Patriot missile defense system, for which even Putin has mentioned is kind of inferior compared to the S-300. Russia's already working with S-400s and S-500s, and I believe this year, next year, so in the sometime in 2023, they're going to introduce the S-550, which will be a tweaked version of the S-500. Um, yeah, so I think most of that money is going to be there to keep Ukraine afloat, financially speaking. Um, I
Yes,
think,
absolutely. This is to keep Ukraine from falling into a state. I mean, well, it has fallen into a state of economic disrepair, but this is to keep them from feeling the effects of falling into a state of economic disrepair. As for the rest of Europe, which is slowly taking the same path, maybe not as severely, but slowly taking the same path, we'll see what sort of aid they get. And I will reiterate that maybe the European Union is the 51st state because the American federal government is not doing a thing for them either.
right, and America has printed more. This is really where the rubber is going to meet the road. America's printed more dollar bills in the last 2 years than in the last 100, which I mean that's great, right? Every time you're in economic perils, you can just print more money, and the magic happens. Um, but at the same time, what is happening is the development of a second world reserve currency. Um, Peskov, of course, sorry, not Peskov, but Medvedev went and met Xi. This is interesting because Putin is obviously doing a lot of things right now, and he didn't go to meet Xi, but Medvedev did, and that's kind of like a big deal because Medvedev didn't go to meet Wang Yi or a lower level um, politician or diplomat. He met the president himself. There's something afoot, right? Like you have all these meetings that are taking place. Zelensky coming to the U.S. Something is developing, and uh, when you have a country that just keeps, the only thing propping up the American dollar really is the influence and it has over its colonies
Well, I think
and
you
its
said it
military.
best.
Hmm?
This was about in 2018, 2019. The true backing of the US dollar is not trust, it's not gold, it's not even the petrodollar. It is nukes and aircraft carriers.
Yeah, yeah. So, and the admonition from the Washington Post that there's no evidence to prove that Russia blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, that's really like the U.S., probably the neocons, bragging that, yeah, we blew it up. So what? What are you going to do? Uh, it's kind of the same thing with Merkel saying, "Oh yeah, we weren't never serious about Minsk." Um, it's a flex, right? Everybody knows what America actually is and has been for a very long time.
And nobody is shocked, at least nobody with half a brain is shocked, I'll put it that way. So,
Yeah.
just to round out the show, I just do have some news out of the Middle East and Asia. So I'll start with the Middle East because it's very brief, just a couple of news items out of Syria and Israel. So you have out of Syria, the Syrian Arab Army and its allies have recaptured a small village in central Syria from ISIS. Now, you still do have these small skirmishes going on with ISIS, which the Syrian forces themselves say are far from over, but you have this slow campaign still continuing in Syria in order to whittle down their forces while denying them their oil and their food resources from the occupation forces in northwest Syria. But with the advent of Operation Clawhammer, you do have a bit of a window of opportunity to change the situation there, at least the Syrians do, that they have been able to send reinforcements to northern Aleppo as a result of Clawhammer, that in cooperation with the Kurdish forces, they were able to send about a dozen battle tanks as well as infantry fighting vehicles to the stronghold of the quote unquote Syrian Democratic forces. So it does seem that with the White House's tacit approval of Claw Sword, which is the current Turkish military operation, you finally have at least some elements of the Kurdish forces in Syria coming to their senses and finally agreeing to a cooperation with the Syrian forces. So this is all amidst the attempts by Russia to bring about a reconciliation with Syria and Turkey by trying to arrange a meeting between Erdogan and Assad, because you will recall that a little more than a few months ago there was a genuine detente between the two countries, but with the beginning of Claw Sword in November, that rapidly fell apart. Now, this is not the worst relations that ever been between the two countries. We're not back to where we were at the height of the Syrian civil war, but tensions certainly have grown. Although you have Russia as a mediator this time, and I would say it is a rather matter of when rather than if we get a meeting between Assad and Erdogan. They already did have a phone call back when you had the initial rapprochement between the two, but this is, I would say, a pretty major development in Syria when it comes to the amount of Syrian forces being able to move into Kurdish held areas. Now, granted, these are in northwestern Syria. Northeastern Syria is still a different story for the time being, but as the situation continues to develop, as American forces become more and more marginalized in northeastern Syria, it could be much like Afghanistan, where it is a finger they have to cut off to save the hand in order to prop up the war effort in Ukraine or Taiwan or whatever the newest battlefield may be. You could see, once again, a greater assertion of Syrian authority back over their own land in cooperation with the Kurdish forces there. But overall, although it is just in a small pocket of northwestern Aleppo and doesn't have anything to do with northeastern Syria at this time, it is a generally positive development we're seeing, that after several years, after what should have happened about 4.5 years ago, you do have a burgeoning cooperation between the Syrian Democratic Forces, quote unquote, and the forces of the Syrian government.
Right, and America did put pressure on Turkey not to attack the Kurds. Um, uh, Basically, Erdogan's offensive has not been successful. There was a fairly successful air campaign at the beginning, but the ground forces have not been successful. And it's kind of funny because it was America that goaded Turkey into going into Syria in order to complicate the situation before they arrived in greater force. So, um, and as much as Assad feels like he has to work with the Kurds are not a people that can be trusted for Syrian sovereignty. The Kurds will betray them, and the Kurds are as much of an American puppet as the Ukrainians.
I would
So
argue even more, honestly.
maybe even more, yeah. Their entire like existence depends on American strength. All of it, all of it. Uh, if America ever leaves that region of the Middle East, not the entire Middle East, but that region of the Middle East, they're finished.
Yeah, their existence in the Levant, especially, they exist as an American counterbalance to Turkey, Iraq, and Syria.
Yeah.
And while my statements previously may have implied most of the Kurds have gained their senses, enough of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which isn't necessarily Kurdish, now keep in mind that's an umbrella term, it's majority Kurdish, but there are other Arab and non Kurdish, non Arab
Mm-hmm.
groups
Mm-hmm.
operating within the Syrian Democratic Forces as well. So you could see a fracturing of the organization known as the SDF as time does continue to go forward. They'll rebrand because, of course, the U.S. has the Kurdistan Workers' Party under some form of sanction. They also have the YPG under some form of sanctions. So they'll create as many shell organizations as they need to in order to keep this influence here as long as they are in the region. But the idea of the SDF as we know it is likely coming to an end. I can only see the constituent groups fracturing within that. I doubt you would get a inter-Kurdish feud because, as you were saying, Kurdish ethnic identity is dependent on being that wedge for the American empire against the respective countries that they are in, whether that be Turkey, whether that be Syria, whether that be Iraq, or even Iran increasingly. So I don't see too much of a breakthrough between Syrian government forces and Kurdish forces,
Mm-hmm.
but it does seem that the groundwork in order for them maybe at least to win back the populace or win back some control of the ground from this vast swath of area the Kurds control is possible. Because keep in mind, you have the SDF, which is the majority Kurdish leadership, ruling over this large patch of northeastern Syria, which is majority ethnically Syrian Arab. So when it comes to who the populace will support, if the Syrian government is serious about reasserting control over that, they would likely have many of the locals on their side.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point. Because Syria is a very, very complicated conflict.
That is once again far from over, and ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you, and perhaps this is a you know exactly what I'm going to say. I'm
Yes, I
being I
do.
have to eat so much crow on this one. Now I still do have a few months to be proven wrong, but I will say, given current trajectory, it is likely not the last summer of Idlib.
Yes.
2022 is likely not the last summer of Idlib. For a while there, it looked like it, but I regret to inform you that no, it's
It's sad. Nobody's happy about it.
nobody's happy about it. This is probably the most wrong I've been about anything. I will still defend my initial prediction, but fully concede that, barring a miracle in the next 6 months, I was wrong.
Yeah, I hear you.
But with that being said, I do have just some brief Middle Eastern news as well to round it out. You have a trade route being established between Iran and Russia, which comes as no surprise, but you also have the outgoing Prime Minister of Israel, Lapid, denouncing Netanyahu as the most extreme government in Israel's history. And you also have the financial minister Lieberman joining in on that. And Lieberman was in the Netanyahu government for a number of years, and in fact was one of the more hardliners on the Palestinian issue. And now he is reversing course, coming out giving this statement with Lapid and saying that, well, Netanyahu is going to be an extremist. He's going to be dangerous for Israel, and he's going to blah 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 because As soon as the current recess of the Knesset is over for the holiday, for the of course the Hanukkah holiday, for those of you who are curious, you will see them reconvene. You will see the final measures be put in place, and a new government will be sworn in on January 2nd, 2023. And this, I just need to read some of the excerpts of this thing line by line and just take direct quotes from it. So, Lapid and Lieberman criticized Netanyahu for, quote, putting yeshiva students before IDF soldiers, managed to establish gender segregation in law, a person indicted for crimes that is nominating a tax offender to be the interior and health minister, a person convicted of supporting a terrorist group to be a public security minister, and an alleged a building offender to be in charge of the housing ministry. So, this article is kind of making me like Netanyahu. I hate to say it. Am I becoming a Likud supporter? Absolutely not. But man, it is. I'll just say it makes him sound a lot cooler than he actually is. But you do have the current governmental instability continuing once again into the outgoing Lapid government, into the Netanyahu government. I doubt Netanyahu will have any better luck than he did last time or any of the previous governments did, and that it is getting to the levels of what you'd see in a country like Spain or Italy, where the parliamentary system is just becoming completely dysfunctional within Israel. And that is on top of Israel being painted further and further into a corner, which is part of the reason, in my estimation at least, that the campaign against Iran when it comes to supporting protests there has been taken to the level it has in the recent months, because they know Israel is in a corner right now, and that it is probably in the weakest position it has been in a number of decades, since 1973, I would say. Some may say that's a bit of a drastic assessment, but I stand by it. And with that being said, of course, Iran has been the main driver behind that. They have been the one who have managed to bring Israel in the position it's been by reversing the situation in Syria, by supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, by reconciling Hamas and bringing them under this greater umbrella, and by their continued cooperation with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and something of a reconciliation there. Now, I doubt they'll get countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia to revoke on the Abraham Accords, but it is still a foot in the door with influence they have there. It does split their attention. It does make them reconsider things, and the fact that while they may not be fully supportive of the Iranian policy in the region, it's not something they're going to write out because relations are actually improving. But Israel, once again, put in a very weak position. Its parliamentary system is very fragile, and Egypt is also an unknown quantity because, I mean, for the past few decades, they have been tolerant of Israel's presence in the region, but the project involving the Zionist state can turn very sour very quickly given the current conditions. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that because of my personal biases. I say that just looking at the situation, Israel is not in a favorable position by any definition of the term.
Mhm.
But with that being said, I will close out with some news out of East Asia. So, as I had reported earlier, you do have a military buildup out of Japan, and this is even considering the clauses in the Constitution that do prevent them from building a proper military force. But you have a $320 billion plan to upgrade missiles in order to strike China if necessary. And they also cite fears because of the growing tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and sharing, of course, a maritime border with Russia and disputed islands with Russia. And it is going to take the course of a 5-year plan. Well, I wonder if we've heard that one before. To upgrade the Japanese military in order to confront the quote unquote turning point in history. And the Prime Minister Fumio Kishida had said it is his answer to the various security challenges faced by Japan at this time, and worries that Russia set a precedent with the conflict in Ukraine that China may capitalize on that and make a move against Taiwan during the instability. They also cite the current situation in the world in cooperation with America, as we had discussed previously in the show, where you have this American hegemony with Poland and whoever as junior partners. You're starting to see a similar situation where Japan is trying to capitalize on the situation as well and trying to be proactive where they can be at the side. They can be the regional manager for the American empire vis-a-vis Japan, and that they can really exploit the position that they're in now. However, that is not entirely contradicted, but somewhat contradicted by their resuming of imports of Russian oil. So there does seem to be a degree of pragmatism that is winning the day. So you have seen this over the past few years, and even with the relationship with China, that Japan has taken a bit more of a pragmatic approach in trying to really balance itself in the region. Now, of course, because of public opinion in Japan and their ties to the American Empire, being on a more hostile footing with China is inevitable. But even with that, you have seen increase in Chinese-Japanese trade. You've seen increase in energy cooperation between Japan and Russia. So they are positioning themselves both simultaneously as that junior partner of the American empire, but also as a bit of a transitory country when it comes to some of the disputes in the region. And if they play their cards right, they could take on a role very similar to Turkey. Now, I know the American presence in Japan is much larger than it is in Turkey and much more influential, especially considering a lot of the post war treaties. But I would argue, and some of you may call me crazy for this, that Japan does have the potential of taking a position in East Asia that Turkey occupies in Europe.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to put this into the framework of Turkey becoming a gas hub for Europe, a lot of it has to deal with like, I mean, a lot of this anger is basically it doesn't explain all the hostility, of course. Uh, that Russia should how could Russia like have profits in a bilateral agreement with one EU country and other countries that hate Russia don't profit from it, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily describe Turkey, but um, America is always looking for ways to weaken Russia.
Yeah, and that does sound about right. And I know that sometimes some of the East Asian news does tend to take the back burner, especially with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. But let's not be mistaken that there are a lot of interesting developments there happening outside of even just the China Taiwan situation, and that, the, in my opinion, the quote unquote pivot to Asia that a lot of people expected, including Obama, didn't exactly come to fruition, and that a lot of the geopolitical center of the world is still focused squarely on Europe, and that is where the battle for the future is really being fought both figuratively and literally. So it is a bit of a bucking of conventional wisdom when it comes to that because we saw in the 2000s a focus on the Middle East in the 90s and 2000s. Then we saw in 2010s the attempt to pivot to Asia, the rise of China, etc., etc. Then you had the entire situation with the Maidan in Crimea, which eventually boils over into this war in Russia and Ukraine, which puts you could say broadly Eurasia if you want to include everything from Europe and the former Soviet Union stretching even into China, but uh, particularly Russia and its dynamics when it comes to the American Empire, which inevitably will rope Europe into that because of its position in between the two. That has once again, as it has been for about the past 70 years, has reverted back to the geopolitical center of the world. And I don't think a lot of people expected that. I'll be honest, frankly, I didn't expect that. But I think a lot of people wrote off Europe more than it deserved, which led to a lot of people overlooking that dynamic that they didn't expect anything to really come out of Ukraine, despite even the people who fear mongered about Russian aggression, whatever, didn't expect all of what happened in Ukraine to happen, or at least in the time frame that it did. They expected Russia to
Hmm.
collapse. They expected whatever else, but we found ourselves in a position once again where, as I said, the geopolitical center of the world is back in the heart of Eurasia and, broadly speaking, Europe.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is all I had for our last standard episode of the year. If you have any closing items, certainly.
No, that's all I have.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Keep your eye out for our year in review episode because that will be a very fun time. I'm looking forward to that one a lot. So we'll see you either next week or at the beginning of the new year. And for, of course, our friends not on the Julian calendar like yourself, but our friends on the Gregorian calendar, such as myself. Merry Christmas Eve and Merry
Yes.
Christmas. We will see you once again, and just yeah, try to enjoy it. I know the weather, at least for some of us, isn't the most favorable, but just I hope you all have a good holiday weekend coming up, and we will reconvene after that, and we'll see you next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and Merry Christmas and take care.